and welcome to everybody, and particular thanks to Michael. One of the real pleasures of being the secretary of the Mill Road History Society is you never know what email is going to come popping into your inbox next. And Michael, who was then a sixth form student at Hills Road, got in touch with us last June to outline the project he's going to tell you all about and to explore with us whether we had any useful connections for him. We're always delighted when people want to focus on the town rather than on the gown, and we were really pleased to hear that as the weeks went by, all was going well, and some of the people we'd mentioned were able to help. When we finally got to see the finished project, which you can all see on Capturing Cambridge, we were as thrilled as you will be, and I jumped in immediately to see if Michael would agree to give us a talk tonight and to share his work with you. You are in for a real treat. So thanks very much for coming, Michael, and everybody please welcome Michael.
Well, thank you very much, Cara. Whoa. Let me just set up the sharing screen. There we are.
Yep.
Right, hopefully that's all working. Fantastic. So yeah, hi everyone. Thank you very much for logging on, and thank you so much to the Mill Road History Society for hosting me today and for all the help they've given me along the way. They've been really, really fantastic. So my name is Michael Large. I'm a student at Hills Road Sixth Form College, but most importantly, I'm a proud native of Cambridge. So I'll move on there. So this evening, I'd like to share my project with you, which I completed last year as part of an EPQ, which is sort of like an additional A-level, which Hills Road makes us do, although I massively enjoyed it and would have done it anyway. So the project was a collection of 25 sketches and accompanying written pieces about buildings from across the city, and each sketch was combined with so the creative writing about the building's history and architecture, as well as quite often a literary quote, because I thought that might sort of add to it and give a sense of some of what people have written about Cambridge throughout the years. And yeah, I just really wanted to explore people that have lived in the city, lots of stories about the city's history, and yeah, really just go into places more off the beaten track that I thought people wouldn't really have heard of, especially outside of the university, which often seems sort of synonymous with the city. And so just to give a sense of direction for the talk, my plan is to talk a bit more about the project overall, then dive into some of the buildings that I think will be hopefully of special interest to everyone here tonight, sort of in the Mill Road area. Ooh. Don't worry about that, sorry about that. And yeah, and then do a quickish summary of all the other buildings in the project, and then hopefully move on to some final conclusions and some questions. So as you've given a small preview, I'm going to move on to the aims and the outcomes. So with this collection, my main aim was to really fight the sort of, not exactly the stigma, but certainly the prejudices that I think people have about Cambridge, that, you know, even outsiders, but also residents as well. I think that you've got the sort of the ancient core, and then you've got maybe some sort of shopping centres and student housing, and then fields, and that's sort of what there is to Cambridge. But I think that, as I'm sure you all know, is completely not true, and I've certainly discovered more of why that's not true through this project. And so I've lived my whole life here, I was born here, and yeah, I think groups like the Mill Road History Society are really important to sort of changing those perceptions. And so I thought the best way to counter those prejudices was through talking to the real experts, the city's residents and historians. And so my sort of real objective was to get outside and to talk to people, although because for obvious reasons, most of the talking to people occurred through Zooms like this, although I did manage to get outside a bit, luckily. And so, yeah, I should admit at this point that I don't actually live very near Mill Road at all. I'm currently in my bedroom in Arbury, but hopefully that doesn't have to come between us. Hopefully I still have things that I can share with you. And another admission is that before the project, I think I felt quite detached from Cambridge. Because I think even having lived here my whole life, it's quite easy to feel sort of disassociated from the sort of general perception of Cambridge. And I think having no family in the area, we'd spend most holidays up in the northwest or in Ireland with my family. And so it was really only this project that actually forced me to get outside, and the pandemic of course helped because we couldn't go anywhere else. And that really sort of helped me pound the pavements and just see places within this wonderful city. And yeah, it really inspired me to find out what I was actually seeing and how sort of I could tell people about it, really. So that's what I'd like to share with you now. And so I'll move on to somewhere that hopefully will be familiar to lots of you, the Central Mosque, which is on Mill Road. And so as we go along, I'll have the picture, the sketch that I did up, and I'll sort of talk through some of the history and some of the stories. So I certainly don't think I'd ever seen the mosque before starting this project, but luckily my good friend and classmate Amina Rahman, the fantastic spoken word poet, was able to put me in touch with the top authority on all things Central Mosque, her mum Shahida, who is a member, certainly a member, I think potentially a trustee of this society anyway, who was extraordinarily kind enough to give me a personal tour of the building, which is Cambridge's first purpose-built mosque and Europe's first eco-mosque, boasting an incredible range of environmentally friendly elements, including sustainably sourced Swiss timber and a biodiverse garden, which you can see center stage in the sketch, and rainwater recycling. They've got Swift boxes on the roof. I know Shahida told me that some of the birds have mistaken the columns for trees and made nests in there. And they've got solar panels and triple glazing, and it's all sort of very, very modern and swish. And they all come together to produce a really breathtaking building, which I hope many of you have visited or hope to visit soon. They do guided tours with these 16 huge sort of tree-like wooden structures that you can see here, which carry on into the inner hall and really make it feel almost like a forest glade more than sort of an indoor space. And there's the delightful garden here, as well as sort of huge windows that really just bathe it in light. And it's, yeah, a nice change from dodging taxis and delivery drivers on Mill Road, and certainly feels a whole world away. So before the building, the city's several thousand Muslims, I think about 8,000 currently, were forced to use an extremely titchy building, sort of also in the Mill Road area, which was really not adequate. And so I think this building very much came at the right time for the community. And lots of the architecture, it was just surprising, or really, I just felt really touched by how sort of thought through it was. So the walls are sort of the Cambridge yellow, which I'm sure we're all very familiar with. But yet they were also very much Islamic, with the word for God sort of sketched out in the bricks, as well as the golden dome, which is of course reflected in sort of mosques all over the world, but also the lack of the minarets, which they thought would sort of make it more cohesive with the community and make it more welcoming. And and the central garden, which really sort of emphasizes the importance of looking after the environment, which I thought was a really lovely message. And I think this whole sort of sense of the mosque was really captured by something that my friend Amina said to me, which I'll read out to you now. She said, "I think being part of the Muslim community is very special because it almost feels like a family. The sense of unity and knowing that we're all here together, it's just a really nice feeling." And yeah, I felt very honored to sort of be part of that for an afternoon. Yes, but I will move on now just down the road to Bharat Bhavan, which is probably known to most of you as the Mill Road Branch Library, or formerly, which closed in 1998, I believe. And this building is one which really seemed to sort of be most embroiled in conflict at the moment, because while talking to many of my interviewees, they were speaking about the sort of the fate of various of the treasures of the former Indian temple, which I know are very much still sort of hanging in the balance. And that included Piero D'Angelico, who runs a very nice hair salon on Mill Road, and I think is also to some extent involved with the society. I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. But yeah, he very kindly agreed to an interview and was very passionate about the altarpiece, which is really magnificent, which is currently, I'm not sure if it's inside the building or in storage, but anyway, his plan was to move it to a small garden, green space type area along Mill Road, and I know that's very much sort of in talks with the council as we speak, pretty much. So yeah, the Mill Road Branch Library was originally built to mark Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee, opened in 1897, and it was sort of intended to service Cambridge's booming new Eastern district as the first public library outside the city centre, I think. And from what I've read, it seems like it would have been an absolutely sort of stunning occasion. There were coloured lamps and fairy lights, and the ornate cupola, which you can see at the top there, and over 270 sort of important local dignities and celebrities. And yeah, sounds like it would have been a really wonderful event. And over 19,000 books were borrowed within the first year, so it was hugely, hugely successful. And the library offered various attractions like the evening reading room for clean and well-behaved children, which is a personal favourite. And having taken over the library after its closure in 1998, following sort of quite what sounds like quite sad decades of sort of decline and lack of funding and things like that, the Indian Community and Cultural Association leased the building for £1 a year plus maintenance, which turned out to be more of a trap really than a blessing, because the false ceiling needed removing, they needed to install a ramp for wheelchair users, and they needed to fix the windows in the cupola, which had been smashed in a storm. And so all of that was costing tens, if not hundreds of thousands of pounds. And there was also a lack of fire escapes, which meant that they had the usage of the building capped at 60 people, even though traditional Indian weddings can attract hundreds of people. And so all in all, it was very much not a good fit for the Indian community, and they were forced to leave a couple of years ago. And I think they're still looking at sites to rent. Again, that's very much sort of in the balance as we speak. And that was all explained to me by Rasik Katecha and Suresh Patel, who some of you may know. And yeah, very kind of them to give me interviews, and they're very helpful, very delightful. And now I'd like to move on to somewhere still close at hand, I think, but hopefully somewhere also of interest, the Royal Albert Homes, which I certainly admire every day going to and from school. It's a very nice sort of, I don't know, chunk of the past, let's say, sort of on my way to and fro. It's very nice. And so these almshouses, which is what they were originally, were opened in 1859 by the very grandly named Royal Albert Benevolent Society of Decayed Tradesmen and Others, who fundraised for years to have it built in this growing new area of the city, which was much like the growing Mill Road area at the time. Cambridge was sort of very much booming in this late 19th century, and it was opened by the Mayor of Cambridge at the time, Mr. Charles Bowles, very good name, who grew up a poor cobbler's son, but had managed to reach the upper echelons of Cambridge society and politics. So sort of I like to imagine him as someone very much enthusiastic to support this very worthy cause, supporting homes for sort of older people without the finances to support themselves. And so among those first residents were 61-year-old Eliza and 62-year-old Charles Coleman, a retired whitesmith, which is a sort of artisanal metalworker from Norfolk, and Mary Kemp, a retired widow from Ickleton, south of the city, as well as Harriet Pilgrim, who is a little bit unclear. I found her very interesting as a character because she was only 15 years old, so I think she was maybe there as some sort of moral support, or potentially it's a more tragic angle, who was looking for hospice care herself. But anyway, a very interesting character. And with these people in mind, I chose a quote for this page of the book called from Graham Swift's Waterland, the intro to it written by Tim Binding, which I found very moving. And it is, "This fen country is now a land teeming with untold histories, untold mysteries, a land full of people with songs to tell of who and how they were, their hymns ancient and modern." And yeah, I thought it was very appropriate, very sweet. So now I'd like to move on to a bit of a discussion of the process of how I sort of brought this all into being. So my original idea had been to produce, it stayed actually quite stable from the beginning. It was to produce 40 at first, although sort of as I realized that I only had 7 months left and all my schoolwork to do, that quite quickly seemed wildly overambitious. So it got cut down sort of gradually over quite a few weeks. And my first move was to start combing the streets with my little iPad mini that I've got here, just taking pictures of every single thing that took my eye. And so I still have thousands and thousands of pictures of buildings and little sort of details that I really liked. And incidentally, that's partly what you can see here on the front cover, which was sort of trying to find a use for all these pictures that I didn't have of sort of interestingly shaped buildings, which I then sort of drew outlines of and made the front cover. But yeah, so I amassed all these pictures, and at the same time, I began combing local newspapers for interesting stories and sort of bits of information, trying to narrow down my choice of buildings, because I already knew I wanted to do some, for example, the Histon Road Cemetery, which sort of I have a lot of experience with, and I definitely knew I wanted to cover. And I also began researching books and poems related to the city, which could provide me with sort of some flowery literary quotes that I thought I could nab, and it might sort of enrich what I was doing myself. Uh, yeah, by sort of stealing other people's work essentially. Although, of course, for each one, I couldn't quite find a quote that fitted. And yeah, so armed with all this information, I started doing the sketches, for which I would sort of settle down after my homework and do about half an hour usually each evening, and then sketch with the sort of pictures I'd taken on my iPad, sort of 4 to 7 days each one usually took. And I'd keep in mind what my art teachers always said and try and not sort of just go for it and scribble. And I'd sort of very methodically sketch out with the pencil the sort of basic shapes, and then build it up with the pen, and then gradually rub away the pencil and add some color. And so I have some pictures here to sort of show that process for you if I scroll through them. So this was the Barnwell Priory sketch, which we'll see later. And so I took a picture at the end of each sort of evening of sketches to show how I built them up. So this is the sort of blueprint. And then I'd go on to sort of sketch out the sort of the bare outlines with my pens, which my good trusty pen still sitting right next to me, and then build up a bit more, sort of do what I like to call sort of the texturing to really sort of utilize lots of different mark making, that sort of stuff. And then it was just, I don't know, I found it very sort of refreshing to really focus in. I'd spend 20 minutes sketching a window, which felt sort of very different to everything else I was doing. It was very sort of relaxing, really. And then sort of put in some of the shadows, try a bit of cross hatching, then put in the background. And finally, the last sort of few minutes, even just at the end of the last day, I'd scribble on a bit of color and try and sort of bring it to life a bit. And yeah, so that was how I ended up with each of the final pictures. So I did most of my historical research online using local history websites, including the Mill Road History Society and lots of historical sources. And I'd like to give a quick shout out to the Museum of Cambridge's website, Capturing Cambridge, which has incredibly specific information about what seems like sort of every building in the city, about people that have lived there, events that it's been involved with, and the lovely Roger Lilly, who runs it and was able to help me put my project online there. So yeah, a very great website, which I would encourage everyone to check out. And the writing itself was then quite a loose process, I think it's fair to say. So I would sort of read through my historical notes and then have them next to me. I'd soak up the information from any interviews and I just sort of write, really. Again, just sitting here at my laptop, and then I would go back and edit and cut down lots of the crazy weird things that I thought were a good idea at the time, and then sort of leave me with something, presentable that I could put in the final project. So that's pretty much how I did it. And I think now it serves probably for most of the rest of the talk. I think it would be good to just sort of look at the other buildings, because there's 22 that we haven't covered. So I thought I'd like to give a sort of short rundown of each one. And so I think we'll start with the Corn Exchange. Fantastic. And so that's sort of very much in the centre of town, of course. And I'm sure most of you have visited at some point. And it seems like it's hosted Adele, Queen, Pink Floyd, David Bowie. So really, really huge names. And there were so many events sort of to try and squeeze into just a short sort of written section. But I think some favourites included the 1875 sort of bit of rowdiness, where the wonderfully named Mr. Death, who was, I believe, Mayor of Cambridge at the time, who'd sparked controversy by cracking down on student protests. And so they retaliated by burning an effigy of him in the market square. And a hugely influential suffragette meeting also took place there inside the Corn Exchange, with over 2,000 attendees. And even though it sounds like there was quite a vocal minority of men, let's say, who were not very supportive of the suffragette movement, it seems like the vote passed quite easily. And yes, that was a big step forward for the suffragette movement in the city, it seems. And so let's move on to the market quite nearby, which I'm sure you can imagine has an even more eclectic history. It's got one of Cambridge's earliest synagogues, I think in the site sort of around where the Guildhall now stands. And there were, of course, the iconic 1898 protests by male students again, against the acceptance of women at the university, which led to the quite horrifying but very famous picture of the effigy of the female student on a bike hung from one of the shop fronts, which I'm sure lots of people will be familiar with, which was, of course, in the market area. And I think a personal favourite, although again quite sort of horrifying really, was a student whose ear was nailed to the market cross for uttering, I quote, evil and foul words to the mayor, which was thankfully a few hundred years ago now. And then there was a very large fire in 1849, which was apparently hugely spectacular once the chemist's shop went on fire and producing fireworks everywhere. So really interesting bits there. And I think as well there was a lot of whodunit excitement because they believed that the clothier started it, because that's where his stall, the stall is where the fire started, and he was in very dire financial straits. But of course, a fire is quite handy for covering up any evidence, so no one had ever had it pinned on them, and it remains a mystery to this day. So now I think we'll go to the round church, cut off a bit the top there, but never mind, which is another sort of big hitter historically, of course. And I really focused here on the renovations of the 1840s by the Camden Society, which I'd not heard of before, but it sounds like they were really quite powerful sort of in the architectural scene at the time. And they were self-styled ecclesiologists, hoping to promote traditional architectural ideals. And it was a subsequent sort of dispute which really caught my attention, because the church's Reverend Faulkner was outraged at the inclusion of a new stone altar instead of the traditional wooden altar, and he described it as an innovation at variance with canon law, which very strong words for the time. And despite the sanction of the bishop and being outvoted at a vestry meeting and a special ruling from the Chancellor of Ely, all against him, the Reverend Faulkner continued on his quest to remove this horrible thing. And it was only a decision from the Court of Arches, directly under the Archbishop of Canterbury, that managed to overturn the decision and get rid of the stone altar. And so Faulkner then appears to have sort of receded into history, but the Camden Society, which had been extremely powerful, was really shaken by this and essentially dissolved over the next few years as their investors sort of pulled out, which all, centered on the Round Church, which I thought was really fascinating. And now we've got the University Arms Hotel, a lot more modern, but sort of similarly interesting. And to be honest, I've only ever been inside to use the toilet, but certainly outside it looks sort of always very interesting and certainly cheers me up again on my way to and from school. You might be able to tell that lots of the planning for this occurred on my commute to and from school. It turns out that as well as the £80 million recent renovations, the site also hosted a dinner for the University Fascist Society in 1935, which is a lot less savoury, with the infamous fascist Oswald Mosley as its star guest, although thankfully this didn't go completely unopposed, as the university's rival Socialist Society protested loudly outside, chanting, "We want Mosley dead or alive." So lots of high drama there as well. And I think Bill Bryson is quite amusing to include here, because he visited this hotel as part of his popular Notes from a Small Island book, which I'm sure many of you have read. And he really mentions very little of Cambridge, which was quite disappointing, and pretty much all he said was negative, which I thought was quite unfair. But he certainly stayed here and mentions it, and he says, "It was an overpriced modern block, and my gloomy room was lamentably at odds with its description in my guidebook," which, who are we to judge, but certainly a scathing review. Moving on now to the Wilko, which is, sounds quite sort of underwhelming, but its building is really, I'm sure you know, very grand and impressive. So it's over by the Grafenster, and it's very popular for cinema goers wanting to buy drinks that are less than £5 than from the view, absolutely extortionate. But the beautiful building obviously has a lot more going for it, and it used to belong to the department store of Laurie and McConnell, who were very much fixtures of the sort of Cambridge shopping scene throughout much of the early 20th century. And full name, again, another good one, Laurie and McConnell, purveyors of general ironmongery, stationery, and fancy goods, which I liked very much. And they took over in 1891 and seemed to be really very successful until the 1970s, when I couldn't really get to the bottom of what happened. It just seemed they sort of sunk into a sort of bureaucratic mess and had to close, quite sadly. and then it was taken over by Habitat, who also failed, and various other shops in between then and now. And Wilko's giving it a go, and we wish them luck. But it seems, I wouldn't go as far as to say cursed, but certainly none of the shops in it have had much luck. But I'd like to head west now to Eddington, which is quite near me, and it's one of the first sketches, or in fact the first sketch that I did of the project. And so it's the city's brand new, eco-friendly, university-run suburb, where I took lots and lots of runs in lockdown, which again gave me lots of thinking time to sort of think through the project. And in fact, I was sort of so inspired that I did an entire geography piece of coursework on the area and about biodiversity. And I think it was just the sort of the vistas and the feeling of really being on the edge of the world that, of course, being very flat and in Cambridge gives you, but also being right on the edge of town that I think really, really spoke to me. And with that in mind, I chose another very beautiful quote for this one from P.D. James's Death of an Expert Witness, which I believe is set in the city. It says, "His mind stretched out over the deserted fields and the desolate dikes to the wide moon-bleached sands of the Wash and the creeping fringes of the North Sea." And so also in the west of the city, I included the Granta Pub, which, again, a sort of slightly down-to-earth choice, but a very nice old building. And so I just thought it was absolutely magical, and I'd spent sort of a couple of meals there throughout my life, and I thought it would be a really nice thing to include as well, especially to sketch. And so the mill pond had been a gathering place for Celts in very, very ancient times. And I sort of like the link about how they flavoured their alcohol, much like the pub does today, sort of with mugwort and honey and meadowsweet. And I mean, it must have tasted awful, but a nice link. And sort of in between now and then, there were also Vikings, for which it was a very important sort of trading stop-off coming in from the Wash up to Cambridge, which was an important sort of marketplace for them. And most recently, the Fen was, I know, a favourite place for Gwen Raverat, one of the Darwin clan, who lived in the old granary, I think it's called, just up the river, very much in the local area. And she sort of spent many happy childhoods running around here and splashing in the fens and having a great time with picnics in Grantchester. And she saw the introduction of the bicycle to the city. And this is all, of course, included in her memoir, which is very famous, and I'm sure, again, many of you have read. And so now to head east to, I think, hopefully some buildings closer to home for many of the people here tonight. And so there's Barnwell Priory, which we caught a glimpse of earlier, which what I've sketched and what most people think of is actually called the Cellarer's Chequer, which is one of the few surviving fragments of what was once quite a sort of grand, impressive abbey. And in its medieval height, the cellarer was an important role which dealt with sort of accountancy, organising trade, overseeing the use of food. And this building that you see here was sort of his seat of governance, very near the kitchen, so he could oversee all of what they were doing. And yeah, very much in the heart of the abbey. And the monastic community was said to have been founded by Pico of Cambridge in 1092, who was the town sheriff, who promised God to build a priory if his wife Hugeline recovered from her illness, which she then did, and he then made good on his promise. And since then it's been ransacked and burned, and terrible things have happened to it, which maybe explains why much of the abbey is no longer standing. But I think it's a nice link again that many of the surrounding streets bear names relating to monks that have lived there throughout the years, such as Thorley Road, Peveril Road, Stainsfield Road, which, I mean, maybe some people tonight even live on. And yeah, so recalling monks from hundreds, if not thousands of years ago. And then to move on to much further to the south, we've got Cherry Hinton Hall, which is the host of Cambridge's Folk Festival, which again, I'm sure many people have visited, which I have never visited myself, unfortunately, even though I'm a big folk fan. And it's hosted sort of Paul Simon, Sinead O'Connor, and Ladysmith Black Mambazo, who I'm a big fan of. I didn't realise they'd been to the city. And historically, the area was agricultural land with sort of some watermills, some cottages surrounding the village of Cherry Hinton, which was then very much separate from Cambridge. And it seems that there was a village herdsman who inhabited the area for centuries, really sort of the role being passed on to new people. And at the time that it ended, it was a man called Robert, which I thought was a nice detail in the early 19th century. But he was unfortunately forced out in the 1814 Acts of Enclosure, which was one of those things that sort of you can know a very small amount, but really much of it is sort of lost to history. The hall itself originally belonged to the surgeon John Oakes, who transformed the fields and the agricultural land into his own private estate, sort of damming the river, creating his own private park, really. And he was followed by an array of extremely aristocratic sounding people, including a mayor of Cambridge at one point, until the hall was taken over by the council, and then the estate was turned into a public park, which it remains today. And here I should also thank Michelle Bullivant, who is a very active local historian and who was very kind in helping me with research for this particular building as well. And another very famous one is the Leper Chapel, which is, I think, claims to be the oldest, or one of the oldest buildings in the city, certainly. And it started out as a medieval chapel for a leper colony, as the name very much suggests. And so leper colonies were, of course, the places where society's unwanteds were dumped, essentially with their bodily blemishes believed to indicate inner impurities, which is how people justified sort of leaving people to die with a horrible, incurable disease. And they were completely ostracized from society and physically cut off from the world, which is maybe something we can all relate to a bit more post-pandemic, but obviously without a horrible disease to deal with as well, for most of us anyway. I'm sure some of us have been less lucky. The lepers were forced to wear distinctive clothing when leaving the compound, and to stand downwind of anyone they spoke to, and various other sort of draconian rules which they were forced to abide by. And since then, the chapel has been mostly associated with the Stourbridge Fair, which I hadn't appreciated, but was one of medieval Europe's largest fairs across the whole continent, with visitors from across the country and even from other parts of the world, other continents, all coming to Cambridge, which was really impressive for so long ago, I thought. And another quote that I liked here was from Daniel Defoe, who visited the fair in the early 18th century and described the scene. He paints a picture of goldsmiths, toy ships, braziers, turners, milliners, haberdashers, hatters, mercers, drapers, pewterers, a china warehouse, coffee houses, taverns, brandy shops, and eating houses innumerable. So yeah, very much a sense of the chaos of the fair and really just everything coming together in one place. And jumping to a much more recent addition to the city, I thought it might be interesting to look at the Co-op on Perne Road, partly because I didn't really have anything else sort of to talk about in that area, and I wanted to make sure everywhere in the city was sort of represented. And I thought it was interesting to look at the cooperative movement, which has quite a strong connection to the history of the city, as well as Andrew Perne, after which the road is named, who was a very important figure connected with the universities and various college institutions in the 16th century, which allowed him to bring about his most famous achievement, which is Hobson's Conduit, which brought water from Shelford into the city's market to the very grand fountain, which you can see at the head of Fen Causeway today. And the conduit is still very much a staple of the sort of Cambridge cityscape, and that comes from this man here. And now to move on to the south, I'd like to turn to the behemoth that is Addenbrooke's, which employs almost 20,000 people from the local area, and probably several people with us tonight. And I found the story of Joyce Brown, which was on Capturing Cambridge, very captivating. So she came to the UK from Trinidad in 1960, having got thoroughly seasick on the way, from what it sounds like. And she gave decades of her life to helping the sick and especially the elderly in London, primarily at first, and then moving to Cambridge in Addenbrooke's, and then sort of care homes throughout the city. And I was really touched by her observations about how the houses were a lot more drab than she'd expected, and how fog was sort of a strange new concept, but also that her fellow nurses were very kind and welcoming, and she made many sort of firm friends amongst them, which I thought was nice to focus on just one story amongst the thousands and thousands that have to do with the buildings here. And so alphabetically, we reach Anstey Hall next, which has quite a quirky history, I found out, which has been owned by a series of grandiose sort of dynasties, including the Fosters, the Ansteys, after whom it's named, the Thompsons, and at the moment the De Bruins. And the current owner, John De Bruyne, is really quite a character from what I've read. He reportedly regales all his guests at the B&B, which is what it now is, with stories of his royal ancestors and of his father who invented araldite adhesive. And he even went on the Channel 4 show Four in a Bed, which was only in 2015. So people might even have seen it, although apparently somewhere else in the country won, which seemed quite unfair, but anyway. And another quote here that I liked was from William Wordsworth from his poem Residence at Cambridge, where he writes, "Beside the pleasant mills of Trumpington, I laughed with Chaucer, in the hawthorn shade, heard him while birds were warbling tell his tales of amorous passion." Then quite a step change to the much, much more modern new CB1 development around the station, which is, I mean, being built as we speak pretty much. Certainly none of the sort of older history. And there, I have to admit, I spent most of the time in the book talking about, whining really about a geography field trip that we had to take to assess the environmental quality of the area in the absolute pouring rain last year. But there was a much more serious side to it as well. I hadn't realised the extent to which Brookgate, the developers, had bulldozed a sort of an entire street of old Victorian housing and had been reportedly very much sort of bullying the council to get their own way. So, yeah, a darker side to what was for me quite an inconsequential experience, really. But yes, then sort of quite similarly architecturally is Great Kneighton or Great Kneighton, I'm not entirely sure to be honest. So despite being, again, barely finished and I think still under construction places, it actually has quite a surprisingly rich and deep history as a site, including Bronze Age field systems and an entire Iron Age village, including roundhouses and a cemetery and granaries. And then on top of that, sort of through the soil structure, there's Roman remains and there's a quarry from the Middle Ages. And there's also evidence of use in the 1950s and 60s as the county agricultural showground, which was, yeah, surprising to me, having never experienced it. And once again, the sort of official records, you can sort of catch a glimpse of the people that would have experienced places like these. So there was a Mr. Eddleston who was farming here in 1851, farming 171 acres with 7 employees. But by 1871, he had only 40 acres and 3 employees. And I had quite a good time sort of imagining what might have happened to him. Although it's likely lost history, although I think probably urbanization, enclosure likely had something to do with it. But who knows, maybe he decided to downsize, maybe he got bored, who knows. And then to move on to another library, sort of similar to that on Mill Road, and I think was built shortly afterwards, also in the sort of booming eastern area. It's Rock Road Library, very excitingly named, I thought. And it's a very adorable sort of red brick structure that you can see here, opened in May of 1936, with the local heroine, Councillor Clara Rackham, who I'm sure many have heard of, who was there at the opening, and also linking into the suffragette movement, which she was, well, not the sort of original suffragette movement, but certainly women's rights generally, she was very much a part of, as well as the cooperative movement and sort of social justice movements like that. And yeah, so the library was intended to educate the slum children of the area, or at least the very sort of poorly educated children, and seems to have been, like the Mill Road Library, very, very successful with over 100,000 books borrowed in the first year. And not to sort of stoke any local libraries, but again, the Friends of Rock Road Library were very helpful with research for this particular item. And yeah, the final item in this sort of southern group of buildings is somewhere that I think it's the only one I've never seen in real life. I've only seen pictures online. It's called the Sun House, and as the name suggests, it's just someone's house. which I found on Capturing Cambridge, and I was really struck by the architecture, which, as you can see, is sort of very distinctive Art Deco, which is very uncharacteristic for Cambridge. But luckily, it turns out that Karen Rome, who is a Dutch entrepreneur and owner of a software company, lives there and runs a business out of the house. So I was able to get in contact with her and talk to her a bit about her experience there. And so she's sort of, yeah, I liked the sort of irony of a very much a historical house with something so modern as a software business, which sort of links to the Silicon Fen concept, with Cambridge as the home of the Raspberry Pi and home to a Microsoft headquarters, and certainly very technologically advanced. And now I'd like to move on to some buildings more sort of in the north of the city, so very much my home terrain. Starting off with Arbury Court, which, yeah, a place I know very well. And so this group of local shops and businesses acts as a hub for the Arbury area, and which was built as a planned suburb in the sort of mid 1900s. The area hosted and still hosts actually a remarkably active community, which has campaigned successfully sort of for all things from nurseries and green space to more recently the Gurdwara, which you can see on the bottom right, which opened in 2013. And again, much like the mosque, was the first sort of purpose-built space for the Sikh community. Yeah, and it hosts a carnival every year, which unfortunately I've not yet been lucky enough to visit, but the pictures are breathtaking, sort of all singing, all dancing, colours, foods, everything. And that is usually hosted every year and sort of brings all the different groups within Arbury together, which sounds lovely. And the next building I'd like to talk about is Chesterton Tower, which again is one that I've sort of never really heard spoken about before, but is very much tucked away in Chesterton, which even though I went to Chesterton Community College for 5 years, I never actually got to see. And the building is, again, very much one of the oldest in the city amongst this project. And it was given as a gift from Henry III to papal legate Cardinal Guala Biceri after the cardinal ruled in the 9-year-old Henry's favour, which allowed him to be crowned over, I think, a French challenger called Louis. And so Henry was obviously very grateful for that and gifted him this house to live in, and more importantly, the revenue from a local church which supported the Italian monastery from which he'd come. And so the building belonged, slightly strangely for Cambridge, to an Italian abbey for centuries, although it now belongs to the council, much like some of the other buildings, and is surrounded, slightly sadly, by some 60s flats. But I suppose the people inside get a very nice view of the tower, so that's something at least. And moving on, I really wanted to include the Golden Hind Pub, which I go past again very often, and I always just was really captivated by the sort of strange huddle of little triangles and chimney stacks and towers, and I always thought that it would be something really spectacular to draw. And the pub allowed me to introduce lots of the characters that I'd reached out to, because I also spread out a survey, which is, I think, how I first came into contact with society, which got lots of responses from people sort of across the city who I'd never met before, who shared lots of sort of very interesting and touching personal detail. And I was able to include lots of that with this building, lots of their stories, including Pete, who helps run the local Chesterton Eagles Youth Football Club and is a regular at the pub, and someone who nicknamed themselves Mole, who loves the folk club in the attic and was very, very generous with their time for me. And my own dad, who goes to the pub every so often to watch a Liverpool match when he doesn't really fancy watching it alone at home. Yeah, so that was a nice sort of community item that I really wanted to include. And then, sorry, I'll just move. Then we've got Histon Road Cemetery, which is, I think, as I mentioned earlier, somewhere that's very sort of special to me. And it's been in my life for as long as I can remember, because although we moved house, we've always sort of lived around Hills Road, around Histon Road. And the cemetery is obviously a really good place to uncover sort of lots of hidden stories and lots of lesser known bits of history. And that included the stories of Henry Aylett and Edmund John Dorbin, who were both young men tragically killed in the First World War. And that was very touching to sort of look into their stories and their local families, despite coming from very different sort of wealth brackets. They actually had quite similar stories of going out to fight in the war and then being killed. And yes, I've got the final building to discuss is the Kingsway Flats complex, which is quite near my house. And again, this is one that I've always sort of wanted to sketch. I thought the shapes were really interesting, and as the tallest building in the area, it always held a sort of gravitas, which I really wanted to explore. And yeah, I wanted to sort of move away from some quite obvious stories, like it was burnt down a few years ago, and I thought it would have been sort of quite easy to talk about poverty or crime, which are stories that people quite often choose to tell about sort of council estates in the city, but I wanted to move away from that, and so I chose to explore the history of Roman Cambridge, because Aikman Street, which was one of the arteries of the Roman city, went past, from what I understand, it seems to have passed right by the sort of site of the modern flats. And so it ran from the hub of the Roman city, which was Castle Hill, where there was, unsurprisingly, a castle and the sort of nexus of the town. And then it ran past the flats here, past sort of bathing complexes, large villas, large mansions, and out into the fens to King's Lynn, I think it was, where it ended up. And there, I thought I wanted to finish on something that I thought was a nice quote for these flats, but also for the project as a whole, from an old travel guide called The Buildings of England, Cambridgeshire. And they wrote, the Roman settlement at Cambridge, Dura Ponte, was never a place of grandeur, but a workaday place. And I thought that was, yeah, a good thing to mention. So now just to move on to some conclusions. So throughout this project, I've really come to understand how rich the city's history and the people can be, and that a surprisingly large chunk of that has very little to do with the university, which did surprise me. I expected it to sort of come into the picture more, which it really didn't. And I've been really taken by the generosity and the enthusiasm of the people I've met. And it does seem quite sadly ironic that I've only come to appreciate the city, as I intend to leave it later this year to go to university. But I suppose, you know, better late than never. And yeah, also as a small final note, I've been told to mention by my dad that we have about 20 sort of paper copies, which he had printed, intending to give to friends and family. Actually, I've got one here. So if anyone fancies a free copy, you know, we'd like to shift them. So I'm sure you can get my email off the organisers, and we'd be happy to send you one. Yeah, so all that remains is for me to give way to some questions. So thank you very much for listening. I very much enjoyed it.
Yes, thank you, Michael. That's brilliant. I think we're all quite rapt with that. There's a whistle-stop tour of the city, and still taking quite a few little bits of information that I certainly didn't know about. So yeah, so there's a few questions in chat. Do you want to just go through them, or do you want me to read them out for you?
If you could read them out, actually, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so we got a question from Lucy. Is it a one-off project, or do you think you'll do more?
Yeah, well, so it was intended to be a one-off project because it was part of this EPQ. So it was my EPQ essentially. So that's now done and finished. So it is intended to be a one-off, but quite a couple of things like this now have sort of come off from it, and I'm really sort of excited that I can still sort of talk about it and learn new things. So in short, I think it is a one-off project, but I'll definitely continue to be interested and to learn and to try and build on it. Yeah.
Find out more about the city as you go along, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you have a favourite in the drawings, and which had the most surprising history?
Oh, this question would come up. I thought,
there's always going to be which is your favourite?
Exactly, of course. They were all my favourite. I love them all. But also, I think you might be able to tell from the one I included as the sort of the tracking the progress. I think I really like the Barnwell Priory sketch, just because I think it really sort of spoke to the artist, just being sort of very nicely contained, having nice little colours, sort of little bits to focus on. I thought I had a lot of fun sketching that. And I think history, in terms of sort of volume, like the market, the corn exchange, there was just so much there. And the market, there was a lot that really surprised me there, although of course, you know, there's always going to be a lot going on in the centre of the city.
In the market.
Yes. But I think yeah, some of the more out of the way places were things that I really hadn't expected. Like, I didn't realize that the mill pond had actually been quite a sort of central feature of ancient Cambridge, sort of for the Celts and for the Vikings. And so even though, you know, I was in theory only talking about a pub, I actually learned quite a lot about sort of quite ancient history. So yeah, I think all of them really had a lot to offer.
Oh, before I forget, can you just close down the sharing of the screen so we can
Yes,
see
sure.
the people properly? That's better. Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
Okay, good. So yeah, lots of congratulations. Were there any buildings you didn't include but would have liked to? Asked Caro.
Yeah, so that very good question. I did admit, of course, that I started off with 40, so a couple did cut. I think there were a couple more that I wanted sort of just for the sketching value, like the old granary, which is actually where Gwen Ravarat, as I mentioned, grew up, which is, you can see, I think, from is it called Sheep Fen? I think anyway that there's sort of a water gate and a sort of overhanging gallery, which I thought would be really fun to draw, but it actually belongs to Darwin College, and I thought as I got sort of more purist in my ideas for the project that it wouldn't be right to include a sort of university building, so that one got cut. And I was going to include the airport at one point, which I thought would have been really interesting.
Yeah, beautiful.
Yeah, because I've actually flown out of it, which still seems a very sort of so I once flew from Cambridge to Dublin, and so I really wanted to learn more about why Cambridge has an airport despite being so small. Although in the end, I couldn't sort of quite somehow find enough sort of to get together, and also it would have been quite strange to sketch because there aren't many sort of single buildings. It's all a bit disparate. So yeah, there were a couple that got cut, but I certainly kept the ones that I really wanted to do.
Good. And did you come across a building you couldn't find anything about and it remains an enigma?
There was one actually that I remember, which was again a university building, so I would have probably ended up cutting it anyway for my sort of idealistic purposes. But it was, I don't know if anyone knows, on the corner of Stories Way, near Fitzwilliam College, I think it is. There's this very sweet little house which I think belongs to the college, which has a sort of octagonal turret, a little cupola.
Oh, I know.
Is near where my mum used to take me to nursery, and I used to walk past it and sort of have a little ogle and wonder what was going on inside. And so I would have loved to talk about that, but again, being a private house, I really couldn't find any information about it, which was a shame.
So would you have gone and knocked on it if it hadn't been for pandemics preventing?
I think I would. I do. I would have loved to have a little chat to the person inside, but they might have been. Yeah, I was quite conscious with all of this that walking around taking pictures of people's houses with an iPad looks a bit weird. So I keep sort of a low profile throughout most of it.
Okay, that's all we've got in chat so far. Does anyone else have any questions? Feel free to just speak up, unmute yourself and speak up if you have something you'd like to ask Michael.
Michael, you've been so generous to us this evening. I was particularly pleased to see about the process, which of course we couldn't see on Capturing Cambridge. So thank you very much for including that. It was fascinating. I want to ask a cheeky question. I hope you got a really top grade for this.
Strangely enough, I don't actually know. Because even though we finished in the first year, we don't find out till results day, so I don't know, unfortunately. But my teacher was very impressed, so hopefully it's good.
Good.
Yeah. Ooh, I think someone's asked how old I am. I'm 17. So hopefully this will go places. That's what I'm hoping. Museum of Cambridge might like to have a few copies. Yes, I think I've not yet got in touch with them to mention that, but I think the ones we have turned out quite nice, and I think potentially I should get in touch with them.
Yes, I think I was going to suggest that actually is a good, if you don't get enough requests for ones directly, then putting some there would seem like a sensible place for for people who are likely to be interested in that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and perhaps a slightly self-interested part of me thought it might be fun to leave it in sort of one of those like telephone libraries.
Yes, wouldn't it?
Leave it somewhere and see sort of who picked it up, pretend sort of thinking it was a proper book.
Oh yeah.
That's a bit of a fantasy of doing that, to be honest.
Yeah, if you get it laminated as well, so that to protect it from the weather, that'd be even better.
Yeah, exactly. An all-weather experience. That'd be great. Will this be shown on YouTube?
Simon, there's a question about will it be shown on YouTube, and yes, this certainly will be available on.
Oh yes. So I'm just while I think about it, I'm just posting the link to the Capturing Cambridge page, which has got an overview, and then there's a link in there to the PDF, which is the actual project of Michael's itself. So you can download that and see all the sketches and the history and quotes and everything. But yes, the video of this will be up on YouTube at the weekend, if not earlier. So you will be able to catch up from the start. Oh, a new question. Is your style of sketching influenced by a particular artist?
That's a good question. I think, well, I haven't sort of studied art in a while, so not directly. I mean, I did lots of YouTube tutorials, so potentially various random YouTubers, you could say. But no, I just sort of tried to, I think it's sort of my attempt to be as sort of close to reality as possible, which, since I'm not a sort of trained artist, is obviously not sort of very photorealistic, but I think it's sort of definitely evolved over the project. I think you can see that the Eddington one I did first is quite, I mean, it's a slightly different building anyway, but it's, I think, maybe slightly less, I don't want to say less good, but certainly less developed, I think, than some of the later ones. So I'm not sure really. I think it just sort of happened, to be honest.
Well, I think Gwen Revera would be very proud of you, Michael.
Thank you. Yeah,
she loves doing buildings too. She really did.
She sounds like someone I would have loved to have met. She sounded, yeah, I really enjoyed sort of reading through.
Yeah. I had a friend who used to go and read to her in her old age, and wow. did love her.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah. No, she sounds like, yeah, she had a real sort of real gumption, real personality.
Right, so I'm just putting a link to our YouTube channel there as well, so it will appear at that link when I upload the video for those who want to catch up from the start. You can also get to there from the front page of our website, because that's unfortunately an unmemorable link. When we get to, I think, 100 likes on the channel, then we can upgrade to a better link. So like and subscribe, everyone. Right. Oh, and Mary suggests giving a copy to the Cambridgeshire collection, which is a good idea actually, because that's a permanent store for them. It'll get tucked away somewhere and will be there for posterity.
Yeah.
Okay.
It might not be very good internet safety to put my email in the chat, but I was wondering, is there a way that people could
yeah, if they want to email me, so yeah, admin@millroadhistory.org.uk, then I can forward on any messages. So if anyone would like to get in contact,
yeah, so as I say, my dad's quite keen to shift the copy.
Yeah, so yeah, anyone who would like a copy, then
certainly want a copy. Certainly.
And we'll send them on, send it on to Michael.
Well, I just want to say a huge thank you on behalf of us all to Michael for tonight. I told you it would be a treat, and it really was, wasn't it? Absolutely great. And I thought Michael has allowed me to share with you the very good news that he's got admitted to Oxford. So shame he's going to be moving away from Cambridge, but many congratulations. That's a huge achievement.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. We've all really enjoyed ourselves this evening. It's been terrific.
Thank you.
That's great.
Oh,
okay, well, thank you, everyone.
If you want to do donations, please go to millroadhistory.org and press the donate button. It'll be terrific.
And if you're not subscribed to the mailing list, although I suspect everyone here is, then you can find a link on the website as well and be told about all our upcoming events. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. I will now close down the meeting.
Thank you very much, Simon, and thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Em.
Bye for now. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.